Alright, everybody, let's get this show on the proverbial road. So, we had a civil war on Monday, pitting Parliament against King Charles I, and we ended with the defeat of Charles's army by Oliver Cromwell in the New Model Army in the Battle of Naseby, 1645. Today we're going to see what happens after you defeat the king in a civil war, and the answer is a revolution. A Puritan Revolution is discussed by John Coffey in the chapter on the website. But before we get to the Puritan Revolution, a little word about religion in 17th century England. In a perfect world, I would have started this class with the Reformation and Martin Luther, but that would have meant we would have had to have started last November in order to actually fit this thing in before May 2nd. So, a little word here about religion. You've got three main factions, if you will, in 17th century England. On the one hand, you have probably the majority, probably 60, 70% of the country. We call them Episcopalians, because in Latin, episcopus is bishop. And these are supporters of King Charles, supporters of the religious status quo. They had no problem with William Laud's Beauty of Holiness campaign in the 1630s. These are Church of England, mainstream, what we now call Anglicans, the Anglican Church. And then you've got people who have looked across the border at Scotland and like what they see. Scotland had a much more thoroughgoing Reformation, Protestant Reformation, than did England. In Scotland, the hierarchy of the church has been radically altered. Down in England, you still have bishops, and they are in charge of their diocese, and below them are the individual priests and the individual churches. In Scotland, the bishops have been circumvented by assemblies of preachers, of ministers, called presbyteries. And the word Presbyterian comes from the Latin word for preacher. This is a much more diffused system of church governance. And it's very Scottish. The Scottish Kirk, i.e. the Scottish Church, is Presbyterian. And some people in England, by the 1630s and 40s, have come around to the belief that this is a better system. This is a more Protestant system, because bishops, after all, remind some people of Catholicism. And for a lot of Protestants, the worst thing in the world is Catholicism. This is probably a healthy minority of the country, say 30%, ballpark. They dominate, though, Parliament. The Protestant revolutionary Parliament that's been fighting against the king is largely made up of Presbyterians. It's Presbyterians who signed the Covenant in 1637 in Scotland to fight against King Charles. Then a third group, the most radically Protestant of all, go by a variety of names. Sometimes they call themselves independents. Sometimes they call themselves seekers. Their enemies call them Puritans because they are puritanical. No dancing, no gambling, no drinking, no fun. They call themselves, in general, though, the godly. The because they see themselves as the most religious of all the people in the realm. Oliver Cromwell is in this camp, as is most of the New Model Army. Parliament's largely made up of Presbyterians. The army is largely made up of quote-unquote Puritans or independents. These are vehemently anti-Catholic people. These are people that believe that Charles may have been a Catholic. His wife certainly is Catholic, Henriette Murray, the French princess. And these are the people who want no agreement with the king. So I'm going to turn it back over to David Starkey here for a few minutes to talk about what happens after the defeat of the king.
On the 7th of June, 1647, Charles I met his nemesis, Oliver Cromwell, for the first time, when Cromwell and the other army leaders came to offer the king a deal. Following his defeat in the Civil War, Charles was now Parliament's prisoner, but he found himself in an unexpectedly favourable position. The divisions among his enemies were becoming wider by the day. The Presbyterians in Parliament, like their allies, the Scottish Covenanters, wanted to impose their form of religion on the whole nation, whereas the independents in the army wanted an end to religious prescription and the toleration of all forms of worship, so long as they were Protestant. Both sides knew that to swing things their way, they needed the political legitimacy which only God's anointed sovereign could command. Hence the deal offered by the army. It was a triangular game in which the king seemed to hold the strongest hand. But Charles characteristically overplayed it, rejecting the astonishingly lenient political terms he was offered by Cromwell and the other army leaders in order to guarantee religious toleration. Instead, in a cynical renversement d'alliance, the king joined forces with his original enemies, the Scots Covenanters, in return for the king's promise, which he had no intention whatever of keeping, to impose Presbyterianism throughout the British Isles. The Scots invaded England to restore King Charles I and to wipe out the new model army with its damnable belief in religious toleration. But in August 1648, the Second Civil War, as it became known, came to a bloody end in a 3-day battle at Preston. This was Cromwell's first engagement in sole command of the new model army, and he showed his tactical genius by manoeuvring to cut off the Scots' retreat, thus turning a defeat into an annihilating rout, in which 20,000 Scotsmen died. "Take courage," Cromwell wrote to Parliament after the battle, "to do the work of the Lord." In fact, terrified by the army and its radical religious views, Parliament was seeking to make a peace with Charles, which settled the pass on all the main issues of the war. Double-crossed by both King and Parliament, the Army's Council of Officers now decided to strike down both. On the 1st of December, the Army seized the King. On the 6th, they entered the House of Commons and purged it of the 150-strong Presbyterian majority. The Rump, as it was now known, of 50 independents, now proclaimed itself the supreme power in the nation, with the authority to pass Acts of Parliament without the consent of the King or the House of Lords.
So in 2 years, 47-48, things go off the rails. The king makes a deal with his former Scottish enemies, the Covenanters, that if you invade England and free me from captivity, put me back on the throne, I will institute a Presbyterian form of church government here in England. He had no intention of doing that. he was trying to find a way out of the parliamentary jail. And so the Scots invade. And at the Battle of Preston in 1648, Oliver Cromwell, the New Model Army, slaughters 20,000 Scots in one of the worst defeats of Scottish military history. Just a couple months later, the New Model Army, upset that members of Parliament were seemingly close to making a deal with the king, the Presbyterian members of Parliament, that they stage a military coup d'etat. Colonel Pride of the New Model Army leads soldiers into the House of Commons in December of 1648 and purges the 150-strong Presbyterian majority, leaving what's known derisively as the rump of 50 independents, 50 Puritans, 50 people who think like the army thinks, who think like Oliver Cromwell thinks, in charge. This is a coup. This is a military coup. 150 members of Parliament are removed, and only 50 of the most radical, the most puritanical members remain. And in the following month, those 50 radical Puritan independents will put the king on trial for treason. An almost unthinkable turn of events has come to pass. The king is accused of high treason, and the trial is a bit of a farce. The king maintains that this group of commoners has no legitimacy, no right to put him, God's chosen king, on trial. And so, for a few weeks, there's a back and forth. Charles refuses to answer the charges. He simply responds every time, "You have no right to put me on trial." It's essentially what we saw in the war crimes trials of Slobodan Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. A proud man refusing to even grant the possibility that his captors have the legitimacy to put him on trial. But there's a deeper issue at stake here. Is the king above the law, or must he follow the law? It's a theme we'll return to when we get to France in the 17th century and 18th century, with Louis XIV and Louis XVI in the next unit. It should come as no surprise that Charles is found guilty. It was a trial whose outcome was preordained, and Oliver Cromwell famously says, "I tell you, we will cut off his head with the crown upon it." And this is the death warrant. Whereas Charles Stuart, etc., 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 and signed by some of the 50 members of this so-called rump parliament. This was a dramatic event in English history. A man who argued that God had given him a divine right to rule, as evidenced by the first book of Samuel in the Old Testament. 30th of January 1649 is beheaded in front of his palace at Whitehall. We've got a lot of eyewitness testimony about the event. They say that the crowd was silent, and when the executioner held up Charles's head, blood pouring from the arteries, there was no cheering. There was just shocked silence. It's not a popular decision. And to illustrate just how fearful these 50 members of the Rump Parliament who put Charles on trial were, this is the hat worn by the Chief Justice, one of the 50 members of the Rump Parliament, a man named Bradshaw. And it looks like an ordinary hat from the outside, but inside is an iron framework. It is an armored hat, because Bradshaw was fearful of being assassinated during the trial. Charles Stuart was not a popular man, but the overwhelming majority of people in England didn't want to see him executed. That was too much. But the Rump Parliament does it anyway. And with no king, you now have a commonwealth, a republic. For the first time in English history, there is no monarch. There is no king. There is no queen. There is only Parliament. We've got a great piece of primary source evidence from this time. It's from 1651, and it's the Great Seal of the Commonwealth. We have a Great Seal for the United States. It's the eagle, and one claw are the arrows, and the other claw are the olive branches. That's our logo, our emblem. And every king and queen of England had a Great Seal. And almost all of them had on one side the king, over the queen on horseback, and on the other side sitting on a throne with the scepter and the orb, the symbols of office. But this Great Seal is very different. What do you think this is depicting, if you had to guess? Parliament, right down to the wooden floor of the House of Commons. And we have poignant, valid evidence from the royalist side of the equation. From 1649, a little ditty called The New Courtier. This is written by the losers here in the war, who now have lost their king. Since it must be so, then so let it go. Let the giddy-brained times turn round. Since we have no king, let the goblet be crowned. And prove it be reason that it can be no treason to drink and to sing a mournival, not a carnival, a mournival, a made-up word, mournival of healths to our new crowned king. And that quote-unquote new crowned king is the leader of the new model army, the Puritan Oliver Cromwell, who has transformed himself over the course of the war into a very regal figure indeed.
By 1653, England had been without a king for nearly 5 years, and a decade of war had left the country economically drained. But the Rump Parliament proved incapable of producing either a new reformed constitution or of providing effective leadership. Indeed, by refusing to stand for re-election and meeting in almost continuous session, its members threatened to become a permanent and self-perpetuating oligarchy. Was it for this that the army had brought down Charles I? The last straw came when the Rump Parliament began moves to deprive Cromwell himself of his position as Commander-in-Chief. On the 20th of April, Cromwell entered the Commons, dressed as a mere citizen in a plain black coat and with grey worsted stockings. He rose, putting off his hat as was then customary, and speaking moderately in praise of parliaments. But as his passion and his confidence rose, he began to pace up and down, put his hat back on his head, and thundered, "You are no parliament. I say, you are no parliament. I will put an end to your sitting. Call them in, he cried. Call them in. Members of Cromwell's regiment burst into the commons. The speaker was removed from his chair, the mace from the table, and the members of the rump dispersed. England had already lost her king. Now it had lost her parliament. Power flowed, unmitigated and undisguised, from the barrel of a musket. Now Cromwell, with the backing of the army, ruled England as commander-in-chief. But Cromwell was a reluctant revolutionary and was eager to cloak his military dictatorship in decent constitutional garb, as was the army. And the ruling council of officers drew up a new written constitution, the instrument of government. By the terms of this document, the Republican Commonwealth that had replaced the monarchy became a protectorate, and Cromwell was named its Lord Protector or Regent. But the Constitution also provided for a new Parliament, whose members were to be chosen by free election. As a result, the first Protectorate Parliament, called by Cromwell, was packed with members hostile to the Protector and the army. The Parliament of Cromwell immediately picked up where the Parliaments of Charles I had left off, by arguing about the Lord Protector's control of the army, his income, and his right to appoint advisers. And Cromwell responded by behaving also like Charles I, first denouncing Parliament and then dissolving it.
So the more things change, the more they stay the same. Charles had done away with Parliament in 1629 and had ruled alone for 11 years, the personal rule. Cromwell here in 1653 does the exact same thing, not once but twice. First, in a violent military coup, overthrowing the 50 members of the puritanical rump, sending them home, ruling as a military dictator. But he's not a man who lusts after power, not in the traditional sense. He's not a Gaddafi, for example. He wants a legitimate framework for this government. And so, in December 1653, he and his fellow officers in the army draw up the uncreatively named Instrument of Government. Major piece of primary source evidence for us today. So take out your 2-page Instruments of Government, pull it up on your computer, and talk with the person sitting next to you about what you see in this Constitution, because that's what it is. So, collaborative learning time. All right, so let's hit the big beats here. This is a constitutional framework for a republican system of government. You have a chief executive, a magistrate, in the form of the Lord Protector, kind of president, if you will. And notice in Clause 33, that first Lord Protector will be Oliver Cromwell, and he will be Lord Protector for life. Upon his death, another Lord Protector shall be elected. Supreme legislative authority rests with Parliament, which will meet every 3 years. This is an innovation. Parliaments prior to this had met when the king called for them. And this removes the mechanism for bringing a parliament into being from one person. It makes it a regularly recurring event. Our own Congress works in the same way. Congress meets every 2 years, not because the President calls Congress into session, but because that's what they do. There's a fairly wide, for the time, voting rights granted to elect members of Parliament. You have to have £200 worth of property to vote, which means maybe 20% of the male, and of course this is only male population can vote, which is not universal suffrage, but for the 17th century, not bad. In the late 18th century, in this country, in 19th century, there were property requirements for voting, and certainly not every male who was an adult could vote in this country a century and a half later. So, decent for the time. Suffrage. There is freedom of worship. There will be no state church, as outlined in Article 37. This is a break with the past. The church had been an organ of the state. The Church of England and the monarchy were intimately intertwined since the time of Henry VIII, back in the 1530s. This allows for, except Catholics, because that's a very bad thing for these Puritans, people have to find their own way to God. That the independents, these Puritans, have a very personal understanding of Christianity. And you cannot be forced to find a way to God. You have to find it on your own. And so there will be no state church. Whatever Protestant form of Christianity you want to practice, you can practice. That's a remarkably modern understanding of religion, and very much unlike what we saw in England before, where the Church of England was the only game in town, and what we will see afterwards, where the Church of England is the only game in town. And if you're not a member of the Church of England in the 1700s, and even in the early 1800s, you can't take part in many public aspects of society. You have a standing army for the first time, 30,000 men, as outlined in Article 27, 10,000 cavalry, 20,000 infantry. This is also a very modern understanding of the military and its relationship to the government, and the commander-in-chief of that military will be the Lord Protector, just as in our country, the commander-in-chief of the military is the president. So this is an attempt by Cromwell and the army officers to put a Republican cloak onto what had been a military coup when they removed the 50 members of the Rump Parliament in April of that year. So let's see what Cromwell will do after 1653.
Now Cromwell, with the backing of the army, ruled England without Parliament as mere commander-in-chief. This portrait of Cromwell, painted shortly after Charles I's execution, shows how far Cromwell, the erstwhile gentleman farmer, had transmuted into a princely figure in armour, wielding a field marshal's baton and able to exercise supreme power in civil as well as military affairs. But in trying to rule without a parliament, Cromwell was more than ever thrown into the arms of the army and was obliged as far as possible to satisfy its demands. Cromwell's most dramatic concession to the army came in 1655 with his agreement to the appointment of 11 major generals as military governors of the English regions. The major generals were doubly unpopular. First, because they were responsible for the enforcement of the Protectorate's programme of social reform. This showed that the Puritans really were puritanical, since it involved not only an assault on swearing, drunkenness and fornication, but also the attempted abolition of such staples of English life as horse races, casinos, theatres and brothels. Not even pubs were exempt. Still worse, from the point of view of the constitutionally minded, was the fact that the major generals were to be paid for by a 10% income tax on ex-royalists, known as the decimation, and levied purely on the authority of the Lord Protector. Such taxation without consent was a red rag to a bull, and when Cromwell, trying to maintain a balancing act between the army and Parliament, summoned the Second Protectorate Parliament in 1653, the decimation tax
56.
came under sustained attack. Indeed, so concerned.
David Starkey misspoke there. Second Protectorate Parliament, 1656, because as the terms of the Instrument of Government state, Parliament will meet every 3 years, and the first one to meet under the terms of this new document here is in 1656.
Was even this hand-picked Parliament, with Cromwell's arbitrary use of power, that they sought to redefine his position by recreating the office of king, which they'd abolished so eagerly 4 years previously. They set out their request in this document, the humble petition and advice, which urged Cromwell to exchange the title of Lord Protector for that of King. The title and office of a king, they argued, had long been received and approved by our ancestors, and had not God shown his favour to Cromwell by granting him so many famous victories? Might not the royal dignity be the Lord's will? Cromwell was obviously fit to be king, but why should Parliament, which had just killed one king, now seek to create another? The reason was that the powers of a king, unlike those of a Lord Protector, were known and were limited. A king had to respect ancient custom and to seek the consent of Parliament to make law and to raise taxes. King Oliver would have been an altogether more circumscribed figure than Lord Protector Cromwell. But the army was aghast that its godly revolution might amount to no more than the replacement of the House of Stuart by the House of Cromwell. So they lobbied hard against the title of king, and Cromwell himself, after weeks of agonized indecision, decided that God had blasted the title and the name of king. He would accept the powers, and indeed more than the powers of a king, but not the title. But if Parliament couldn't have a king, at least they could have a sort of coronation. Cromwell's original inauguration had been a sober affair, but on the 26th of June 1657, Cromwell was invested as Protector for a second time here in Westminster Hall. And this time there was nothing puritanical about it. Even the royal coronation chair was brought from Westminster Abbey to serve as a centrepiece for what amounted to a secular coronation. Cromwell was invested with a royal robe of purple velvet lined with ermine, a gilt-bound and embossed Bible, a golden hilted sword, and a massive, solid gold sceptre. He swore a version of the coronation oath, and finally, seated in majesty in this coronation chair, he was acclaimed 3 times to the sound of trumpets and the cry, "God save the Lord Protector." All that was missing was the crown itself, and that appeared on his coinage and his great seal. Oliver was now indeed king in all but name. Cromwell had rid Britain of its king, but now, as Lord Protector, he held more power than any king ever had, and his achievements equalled or even exceeded those of any legitimate English monarch. But just 1 year after his second investiture, Cromwell fell ill, and on the 3rd of September 1658, he died at the royal palace of Whitehall. In Cromwell's magnificent funeral ceremonies, any coyness about his royal status was finally abandoned. Cromwell had ruled like a king. He was to be buried as a king, with solemn ceremony, a vast cortege which included no fewer than 3 state-salaried clerks, and at vast expense. Presiding over it all, as was traditional in royal funerals, was a lifelike effigy of Cromwell himself, which wore in death the remade imperial crown which he refused in life. Few British rulers have left a grander legacy, or one that seemed more stable.
And so, 9 years after the execution of Charles Stuart, Oliver Cromwell, his executioner, his executioner dies of natural causes in Whitehall Palace, the palace that formerly belonged to Charles Stuart. It had been in some ways, tumultuous reign for this Lord Protector. He had been as imperious and as disregarding of Parliament as his predecessor, Charles Stuart, had been in many ways. First, purging the Long Parliament of 150 Presbyterian members in 1648 under the leadership of Colonel Pride, Pride's purge, then dismissing the First Protectorate Parliament in 1653, having a very contentious relationship with the Second Protectorate Parliament, the appointment of major generals to serve as military governors with vast powers over the population. These major generals were in charge of the decimation tax, the 10% tax on former royalist cavaliers to help pay for the rebuilding of the country. These major generals were also social enforcers in charge of wiping out gambling, something the English love to do, even to this day. Wiping out drinking, something the English really love to do to this day. Closing down pubs, closing down, God forbid, brothels. All kinds of quote-unquote puritanical social engineering is happening here in the 1650s. As David Starkey said, the Puritans turned out to be, not surprisingly, very puritanical. And it's Oliver Cromwell at the head of this whole apparatus. So, take a few minutes now with your neighbors, do some note comparison. What notes did you take today? Clear up any confusion. Learn from each other. I had to restart.
She never accepted the crown and all that jazz. He's calling third order. 5:32.
What is being there?
One more class.
The part where we talked about the video where they talked about the video for the Battle of Preston.
How long do you think that will process?
I wrote down all of this. These videos are actually,
It would probably be like, once you get in there, it's not going to be the first case. You'll have to wait.
it's all up. Go to like the thing, go back to the rule of law though, and go to the first lecture. I think the PowerPoint should be there. Yeah, there's a list, and then these are all the videos that came out. So you go back and you watch the video. They're no more than like 5 minutes. Which is nice.
Usually, like at that age, like presidents pay the tickets. I had to go to the conference so I could get a class. What was that? You kind of small like. Is it yours?
What?
I've never heard of that. I could lose That's like unheard of. Even possession. It should be the opposite. Riding high.
We got like.
I'm pretty sure like
Yeah, but if you did, I could bring you in
you know how many years
for hacking into the system and pulling down the
if it's by if it's by I could just
So, when we come back next time, important piece of primary source evidence, and the things in blue on the syllabus, I want you to look at before class and to print off and bring with you. And one very important one here is the so-called English Bill of Rights from 1689. And notice that some people didn't have the instrument of government with them today. And we are going to be working with this, again, in pairs. So print it off, bring it with you. It's a whole whopping 2 pages long. And as we're going to see, it's a foundational document for our own country. So we're going to bring the King's Son back on Wednesday. Friday, sorry.
I really like Professor Alexander. I don't know that.